Greetings to you today, and welcome to our daily Devo for Thursday, the 19th of September today. Our devotion is entitled A Christian Home, and the portion that comes from Charles Dickens today comes from his work entitled Bleak House. A Christian Home from Bleak House. Sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? Well, let's find out. I glanced at Mr. Jarndyce's face. It was a face full of change and motion, and his hair was a silvered iron gray. I took him to be nearer 60 than 50, but he was upright, hearty, and robust. From the moment of his first speaking to us, his voice had connected itself with an association in my mind that I could not define. But now, I recall the gentleman in the stagecoach 6 years ago. I was never so frightened in my life as when I made the discovery, for he caught my glance, and appearing to read my thoughts, he asked me what I thought of Mrs. Jellyby. "She exerts herself very much for Africa, sir," I said. "Nobly," returned Mr. Jarndyce. "But you think something else, I see." "We rather thought," said I, glancing at Richard and Ada, who entreated me with their eyes to speak, "that perhaps she was a little unmindful of her home." "Floored!" cried Mr. Jarndyce. I was rather alarmed again. "Well, I want you to know your real thoughts, my dear. I may have sent you there on purpose." "We thought that, perhaps," said I, hesitating. "It is right to begin with the obligations of home, sir, and that, perhaps, while those are overlooked and neglected, no other duties can possibly be substituted for them." "The little Jellybys," said Richard, coming to my relief, "are really, I can't help expressing myself strongly, sir, in a devil of a state." Let's get the help of Gene Fisher to maybe fill in the blanks of this part of Bleak House for us. Mrs. Jellyby, Jellby, yes, that's what it says. Mrs. Jellyby, rich, charitable, and so caught up in creating settlements in Africa, neglected her family. Her husband, children, and household all suffered as she dedicated herself to helping the Africans. Mrs. Jellyby's daughters' pleas for attention fell on deaf ears, and the Jellyby children ran wild. 1 Timothy 5:8 tells us that charity begins at home. It says, quote, "Anyone who does not provide for their relatives and especially for their own household has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever," unquote. The Bible clearly outlines the distinctive qualities of a charitable Christian home. Ephesians 5 speaks on the traits of Christian marriage in verses 22 to 24. Ephesians 6 reminds children to honor their parents in verses 1 through 3. And Deuteronomy 6 emphasizes that God must always be our first priority. And that's in verses 5 through 9 of Deuteronomy 6. When God is the foundation of a Christian home, and when a family lives by the words of the Bible, then generosity and helpfulness follow. Husbands and wives act as one flesh. Together they create the Christian framework. Children learn obedience through Christian love and carry their moral upbringing into adulthood. When charity in this form begins at home, then family members can extend their charity to others by setting a good Christian example. Matthew 7, verses 18 through 20 say, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. Matthew 7, 18 through 20. I once had a professor in school. We got talking about Matthew 7, 1, where Jesus says, judge not lest you be judged. And when you get in the ministry and you're dealing with some people whose life choices have gone astray, and you try to counsel them or at least try and lead them out of that, you'll hear that. Don't judge lest you be judged. And so they don't think, and we don't, not in the way Jesus intends that. That the reality of the word judge there means you're judge, jury, and executioner. You know their heart. You know the whole deal of what's up with them. And that's wrong. That's not correct. But the professor in the classes one day referenced this later, these verses in Matthew 17. And he says, we aren't supposed to judge, but we are supposed to be fruit inspectors. And that, obviously, that has stayed with me for a number of years now since I got out of college. But that's the reality. A Christian home needs to be built on the Word of God, the things that the Word of God says, how we should live, choices we should make, ways we should respond to people in need. It is through the entire 66 books of the Bible. The Old Testament law, which to many sounds harsh, has within it that picture of caring for people in need, of respecting one another. And so a Christian home isn't run by a bunch of do's and don'ts. It's about forming first that marriage, and then as children come along. Are we going to be perfect? No, we're not going to be perfect. But we need to do our best to follow the guidelines of living according to the Word. Again, not because we're afraid of punishment, but because that's how we express our love. If you love me, Jesus said, you will keep my commands. That's the key to a Christian home. Does it have at the center of it Christ? Not just Christian principles, but is Christ at the center of that home? Is Christ at the center of that family? I grew up as a preacher's kid, and I regularly heard, you've got to do that because your dad's the preacher. I resented that. I rebelled against that. I did not want to live according to other people's expectations. So when Sue and I were getting ready to enter the ministry, our children were very, very young, not even 2 yet, I don't believe. That was a decision I made in my head. I will never tell my children, you've got to do that because you're the preacher's kids. We would talk about something and we would put it in the context of what would the Lord want us to do? What choice would He want us to make? And if you raise your children to love Christ, if you're doing that yourself, obviously setting an example to love Christ, to love God and His Word, they'll be more liable, maybe not libels. They may be more prone to following that example that you set in your life. So that's the secret of a Christian home, having Christ at the center of it. And that means prayer, and that means Christ's word. All of those things are at the center of a Christian home. Do we help others like Mrs. Jarndyce did? Well, we help, but we've got to make sure we're taking care of the fundamentals first before we leave them behind and go off and do things for other people. It's a balancing act for sure. Blessings to you today on this Thursday.